In part 1, I described in detail the Keyframe Controller user interface. I also explained the various ways of manipulating keyframes. In this part, I want to deal with the subject of keyframe interpolation modes. To recap briefly, if a particular parameter has had its animation enabled, keyframes determine the change in the parameter's value over a period of time. By default, that change in value is linear. Interpolation modes allow different rates of change. This series of tutorials is for the Vegas Pro beginner, not the expert. Before I get into the subject of interpolation modes, an explanation of basic keyframe animation is required. There are 4 main scenarios which will show the keyframe controller when parameter animation is enabled. Applied video effects, which I described in part 1, the pan crop tool, generated media, and track motion. In this part, I'll be demonstrating keyframe animation and interpolation modes using a generated media event. I have a titles and text generated media event on the timeline. I'll open up its settings. In this example, I want the text to slowly change from white to yellow, then to red. I also want the text to increase to 1.5 times its size, then reduce to half its original size. To achieve this, I need to enable animation for both these parameters. Before doing this though, make sure that the playhead is at the start of the event. In this case, the start of the timeline. With the cursor at the start of the event and both text color and scale animation enabled, I'll move the cursor to the halfway mark. I'm going to create a keyframe for the text color parameter at this point, so I need to select the text color header. I'll now add a keyframe. I'll now change the color to yellow. Now to add a keyframe for the scale parameter, but I'll do it another way. I can simply change the scale value. You can see that a keyframe is automatically generated for the scale parameter. At the end of the timeline, I want the text to be red and its size to be half its original size. I'll click the last keyframe icon. This will get me to the end, even though there's no keyframe there. It's always good practice when placing a keyframe at the end of an event to come back 1 frame before adding the keyframe. Adding a keyframe at the end of the last frame can lead to undesirable results. At this point, I'll change the color to red and the scale to 0.5. Now I'll play the timeline. The rate of change of the text colour isn't obvious, so I'll concentrate on the scale parameter. Because the difference in the keyframe values is small, it's not easy to see the rate of change either. However, if I increase the middle scale keyframe value, it may be more apparent. You can now see that the line between the keyframes is straight. In other words, the rate of change of the scale value is linear. Linear is the default interpolation mode. The only way to show the effect of different interpolation modes is to set up two identical scenarios where one has a different interpolation mode than the other. I've set up two titles and text events on different tracks. Both of them have a lowercase letter o placed at the extreme left of the preview, one higher than the other. They've been animated so that they move across the preview to the extreme right for 9 of the 10 seconds duration of the events. The default interpolation mode is linear, so they should match movement throughout the animation. As you've seen, this is true. Now I'll change the interpolation mode of the green one. To do this, I open up the settings for that event. You can see that the rate of change of the X parameter, that's horizontal, is linear. I'll select the first keyframe, then right-click to get the context menu. I'll change the mode to smooth fade. Now you can see the effect on the rate of change line. I'll play the event. You can see that the green one follows the line. It starts off slow, speeds up, then ends slow. Now for the next mode. This time the rate of change increases quickly, then decreases slowly. And the next mode. This, unsurprisingly, produces the opposite result to the fast fade. The rate of change increases slowly and decreases quickly. Sharp fade is the opposite of smooth fade. With this mode, the green one remains stationary until the last keyframe is reached, then increases instantaneously to the keyframe value. In all cases, because the final position of the two letters is identical and occurs at the same time, the green letter always finishes its movement at the same time as the yellow letter. Note that the interpolation mode of a keyframe only affects the movement between that keyframe and the next one. The normal keyframe interpolation modes will suffice in most use cases. However, there may be occasions where none of these modes give the results that you want. This is where the Curves mode comes to your aid. Having said that, using the Curves mode is not for the faint-hearted. I know that this series is aimed at the Vegas Pro novice, but as the Curves mode is an integral part of the Keyframe controller, I felt that I had to include a section on it. Before I get into it though, I must mention Bezier Curves. For those who aren't familiar with these, basically a Bezier curve affects the rate of change of a parameter entering and exiting a keyframe. We'll get into the details shortly. To demonstrate the Curves mode, I have a titles and text event on the timeline. Again, I have a lowercase green letter O to show movement. This time though, I want to show movement in the vertical direction, so the letter is in the middle of the preview. I'll make a start by moving the timeline cursor to the middle of the event. If you remember from part 1, this can be done by entering the value into the timeline cursor input field. Now to add a keyframe. You'll notice that adding a keyframe for one of the location parameters also adds a keyframe for the other. This is expected behavior. Now, the context menu for a keyframe contains two options at the bottom. These are Bezier curve lock tangents and Bezier curve split tangents. I'll explain the difference shortly. When in lanes mode, that's the mode that's active now, these two options don't do anything. They are only active in Curves mode. I'll switch to Curves mode now. In this mode, there are two coloured lines on the controller timeline. One is thicker than the other. The lines represent the change in value of the parameters through the event. The thicker line represents the parameter highlighted in the timeline header. This will be the parameter that was selected in lanes mode. Now I want to work on the vertical parameter, so I need to click the white header. The thin line now becomes the thicker one and is the same colour as a circle in the Y header. I'll open up the context menu for this keyframe. We'll deal with the Bezier curve locked tangents option first, so I'll click that. As you can see, it seems as if nothing has changed. I'll open up the context menu again. The option is still selected, indicated by the dot at its side. This can be puzzling at first. The explanation is that for a Bezier option to have any effect, there must be another keyframe present. I'll add another keyframe. Now you see the small circle in between the keyframes. This is called a Bezier node and is actually a pair of nodes, one attached to the first keyframe and the other attached to the second keyframe by Bezier handles. You can't currently see the handles because they are the same colour as the line. To create a curve, I simply grab the node and move it. A handle becomes the active one when the node has a white outline. Different curves between the keyframes can be achieved by manipulating these nodes. As you can see, the nodes can be a little tricky to grab hold of. Note that a node can't be moved behind its own keyframe or beyond its adjacent keyframe. If I add another keyframe at, say, 3 seconds, see what happens. A Bezier handle is created on this keyframe, and the middle keyframe has gained another handle, opposite to the original handle. You may be wondering why handles have been created on the 2 additional keyframes when I hadn't specifically enabled the option using the context menu. The reason is that any keyframe added after the initial keyframe will inherit its Bezier curve option. I'll now explain what locked tangent means. If I move one of the nodes for the middle keyframe, the other moves equal and opposite. They are locked together. I'll now change the middle keyframe mode to split tangent. Now when I move a node, it moves independent of the other node. Didn't mean to do that. Now I'll explain why the other 2 keyframes have only one Bezier handle. There are 3 conditions which determine the number of Bezier handles. If there's only one keyframe on the timeline, there are no Bezier handles, even when the option is selected. If a second keyframe is added, one Bezier handle will be created for each keyframe. If a third keyframe is added, the center keyframe will gain an additional handle. So, put simply, to have 2 Bezier handles, the keyframe must have a keyframe on either side. Now I'll play the timeline. Now, what I really wanted was the letter to raise vertically, then lower vertically. This obviously hasn't happened. There's been some horizontal movement introduced as I was creating the vertical curves. Let's look at the X parameter. As you can see, creating Bezier handles on the Y parameter keyframes has also created them on the X keyframes. To correct this, I need to manipulate the nodes on the 3 X keyframes so that they make the line straight, resulting in no horizontal movement. What you must not do is change the interpolation modes. This will destroy the curves on the vertical keyframe. Manipulating these nodes is very tricky, and there's no easy way of doing it. Zooming in on a node can make it easier. You see how tricky it can be to move those nodes. This has produced a relatively straight up and down movement. Creating animations using the Curves mode can be very challenging. This is an example I created. It's not very practical, but it shows the kind of animation that can be achieved. The red line shows the horizontal position of the letter through the timeline. It remains stationary for about 2 seconds, then steadily travels along the timeline, indicated by the slow positive line, until about 8 seconds. It then reverses, as shown by the negative curve, before proceeding normally until the end of the timeline. Now let's look at the vertical position of the letter. This line shows the vertical position of the letter through the timeline. Negative parts of the line move the letter downwards, and positive parts move it upwards. The Bezier handles create the curves. It's important to remember that creating a keyframe for the vertical movement also creates a keyframe at the same point for the horizontal movement. They also inherit their interpolation mode, so changing the mode for one keyframe will also change it for its keyframe partner. Although Bezier curves created by the handles for vertical keyframes can be different from curves created for their horizontal partner keyframes. A working knowledge of the keyframe controller is essential for progressing beyond basic editing. This knowledge, combined with a little imagination, will allow you to create interesting animated effects that will enhance your videos. I fully understand that this tutorial is a bit above novice level. The Curves mode is especially difficult to grasp and can be skipped if necessary until your skill level has improved. Thanks for sticking with me. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. I welcome any questions or comments you may have, which I will respond to. Until the next time, bye for now.